Do I need to stand in a specific spot?
Any place around the table is fine.
I'm glad you have those because I was actually going to use my watch to put a timer, and I was going to have a timer on there, but thanks for having the cards. Do you want me to wait for anything?
No.
Yeah. Okay. So, my proposition is that video game addiction is a growing problem. At first, I just wanted to give a little bit of background information on that. According to the DSM-5, which was updated 3 years ago, they define it as internet gaming disorder, also known as game addiction, which refers to a loss of control over video gaming behavior, which results in significant issues with daily functioning. Now, that's different from internet addiction, because internet addiction deals with Facebook and all these other things you can do on the internet, like endless Wikipedia searching, things of that nature. Compared to alcohol, cigarettes, and gambling, which are other things that we do have addiction qualifiers for, the difference is that video games don't really have any restrictions. Alcohol, there's age. Tobacco, there's age. Gambling, there's age. There's a lot of other restrictions. There isn't anything in particular with video games. And what makes it even more problematic is the fact that there are things like food addiction, for example, or sex addiction, for example, which are things that are sort of essential to day-to-day life to a certain extent. So it makes it difficult to come up with restrictions for it. You can't tell someone to stop eating, for example. And this applies to the video game issue because you cannot have someone not use a computer in this day and age or a smartphone. It's very tempting for them to engage in problematic video game behavior sheerly due to prevalence of the medium. So getting to the actual problems that it can cause, let's say someone is addicted to it. The problems can start with one, diminished school performance. There was a case that I read up on from two guys, Zachary Schmidt and Michael Livingston. They said that they did a study on college students, their GPA performance and how they did based on video game time spent playing video games. Their video game addiction score had a negative relationship with expectations regarding college engagement. The higher the video game addiction score, the lower the expectations for college engagement. Second, it was found that the higher video game addiction score, the lower the first year GPA after controlling for high school GPA. So just because you did well in high school doesn't mean you're going to do well in college if you play a lot of video games. The other problem is social skills. It does affect social skills. There's a study by Lemons, Valkenburg, and Peter that says that their summary concluded that video games suggest that displacement of real-world social interaction resulting from pathological use of video games may deteriorate existing relationships. And another study by Kimberly Young, who's actually an expert on this. She's written several articles on this, and she works at she works at a university in the Northwest. I'm sorry, I just forgot what the university is, but she's been doing this for like 12 years. She's an expert on this. She said, a once outgoing and social husband or wife becomes withdrawn from their friends and family only to spend more time alone in front of the computer. A normally happy son or daughter only becomes withdrawn only to prefer making friends in a game, as the people that were once important in real life become less important. So they're spending so much time doing this other thing that people in real life don't matter very much. The next part is that, so we already covered school performance and social skills, but there's less engagement in sports and other hobbies just due to the time, which was sort of implied in the social skills. There's this notion in the same paper by Kimberly Young, again, she's an expert on this. She said, as the addiction progress grows, gamers become less interested in hobbies or activities that they used to enjoy and become more fascinated with living inside the game instead of engaging in their hobbies, like baseball or like woodworking or anything that you might think of. And the next section is on health concerns, which is a little more simple, but of course if you're spending all your time playing video games, you're not taking care of yourself, you're not maybe exercising, things like that. So it says that, she said that some gamers spend their nights and days online to the point where they do not eat, sleep, or take a shower because they would rather be playing the video game. Now, all those things being said, all those problems that I just mentioned, you might say this is probably a very small portion of the population, which is also true for gambling and some other addictions. It's not a huge portion of the population, but it's still there and it still matters. When it comes to numbers, we have numbers not just in the US, but in the rest of the world. On the US News and World Report, they did a paper on it a few years ago, an article a few years ago. It says that governments in China and South Korea have helped fund treatment centers and hotlines for electronic game addicts. Keith Baker, the director of the Smith & Jones Center in Amsterdam, it's a detox center that treats video game addicts from around the world, compares their poison to crack cocaine. But it's easier to treat a coke addict than a gamer, he says. The gamer's denial is so great, and it's compounded by family and community. Who in the world thinks gaming is a problem? And that's part of the issue. And that's just looking at the rest of the world and some of these other areas that have had to deal with it. In the US in particular, Douglas Gentile is another expert on this from Iowa State University, and he did an interview with CNN earlier this year. And he said, he's a psychologist at Iowa State University, and he's been studying the subject for decades. And he said, the first study I began in 1999 is basically to show how video game addiction isn't a real thing. And it turns out I was wrong. According to his research, roughly 8.5% of children who play video games in the United States are addicted. He found similar numbers across the world. Even though different researchers across the world may define the problem somewhat differently, or ask different questions in different countries with differently aged kids, we find almost the same results across the world. The estimates perhaps vary somewhat, but they all seem to come out somewhere between 4 and 10%. That's the amount of gamers he would classify as addicted. So, all that being said, there's definitely an issue with it, even if it is 10% of the population or less. It's definitely something where there's a significant enough portion where something needs to be at least addressed about it. And this is actually what's important about the DSM rating, is that the DSM just added it in 2013. It's fairly recent, and it's not even an official diagnosis necessarily, but they do say more research needs to be done because this problem is definitely something that we have to deal with in the near future. So it can cause video game addiction can cause diminished school performance, social skills, less engagement in sports or other hobbies, and it can cause health problems. And it's something that is definitely a growing problem we need to address.
All right. All right, Mark, the proposition is clearly identified. I think you explained a little bit about the controversy in the sense that more people are playing the video games, and you kind of draw an analogy to other kinds of addictions that are out there. That's okay. There's not really a preview of what the supporting structure is going to be, so I think that that would help the audience a little bit. But when you do get to the body of the speech, you do a good job signposting those points as you get to them, so that makes up a little bit. And at the end, you do remind us about what those points are, and so the summary, I think, is kind of a way to help rescue organizational issues as well. So I would still encourage you to do the previewing a little bit more, but everything else I thought organizationally was fine. You've got a lot of testimony evidence there. Almost all of it is highly qualified by you. There are a couple of places where some of the references are maybe a little abstract or vague. You know, some university in the Northwest, that's a little bit awkward. But the others, and I know that DSM stands for something that I should recognize, but off the top of my head, I can't pick it out. And you're using it in a couple places to define some things. So I think you should explain that. I would feel awkward if you said it right now, because I know it's something I should know, and as soon as you say, I'll say, oh yeah, that's of course what it is, but I can't do that at the moment. So I thought you did a good job with the evidence for the most part. I think you could use a couple more examples to illustrate the points, but like I said, you had lots of testimony. There's a little bit of statistical information. I do think that you should talk about the percentage of people who play these video games, and then that bit puts those other percentages in a little bit of context, so that we know how many that is. So if it's, there are 50 million gamers in the U.S. and 4 to 10% of them have some kind of addiction, then we're talking about anywhere, from 4 to 5 million people that are running into that particular problem.
The China study was particularly useful for that.
Yeah. So like I said, that would give us a little bit more of a sense, and then you could say, look, that's a pretty big number of people that are going to have a problem, and they're going to have a variety of these sorts of problems. The social skills, the diminished school performance, the lack of engagement in other things, those are a little bit vague. In other words, how big the impact is. For example, how do you measure a decline in social skills? The decline in school performance is, I mean, the study basically says there's a negative relationship, but it doesn't say how substantial it is, how important it is, whether or not it's having a consequence on people. I think that's one of those places where a couple of examples would be really helpful. If you had examples of people who got all caught up in games and they dropped out of college, or they broke up with their girlfriend or something like that. I'm sorry, I should go the other way. They broke up with their boyfriend. How sexist of me to assume that the gamers were guys that would lose their girlfriends. It could go the other direction too. But some illustrations like that, so that it seems a little bit more substantive and not just this kind of esoteric idea of there's some vague harm that's out there.
Yeah, okay.
All right, thank you.